Bob Dylan's The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll is a song rarely critiqued by reviewers, but those who glimpse its charm hold it in particularly high regard. For instance, linguist Christopher Ricks directly praised it as one of Dylan's greatest works. However, in Arcrow's view, this song is actually a skill-flaunting output of Dylan's. To understand this, we need to start with the background. In mid-September 1963, harboring resentment and confusion over the backstage story of the March on Washington gathering, Dylan went alone when invited to Joan Baez's home in Carmel, California. He intended to use this quiet place to sort out his thoughts. But unexpectedly, he encountered there the newlywed Farinas, who had just arrived from France. The relationships among these four people were quite complicated. Richard Farina was an old friend of Dylan's, and Mimi Farina was Joan Baez's younger sister. Joan had a crush on Bob. Bob liked Mimi. Mimi married Richard, and Richard admired Joan. The reason for bringing up this gossip is that it helps understand Dylan's creative motivation. Around the time Dylan came to Joan's home, on September 15th, the tragic black church bombing in Birmingham occurred. In response, Richard composed a song titled Birmingham Sunday.
On Birmingham Sunday, the blood ran like wine, and the choir kept singing of freedom.
This song was highly appreciated by Joan Baez, even diminishing her resentment toward Richard, as she had always believed that her 16-year-old sister Mimi was tricked into marriage. Baez began praising the song in front of Dylan and frequently practiced singing it. Dylan seemed provoked by a sense of competitiveness. So he casually drew upon another case, the Baltimore, Maryland murder trial verdict announced on August 28th, to compose The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. Let's first compare the narrative techniques of the two songs. Richard's Birmingham Sunday follows the most traditional route. First, the background is set, then the victimization process of the four girls is introduced one by one, and it concludes with a thematic sublimation of the event. In contrast, Dylan's The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll adopts a modern narrative structure. The first line of the song cuts directly to the murder. William Zanzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll. Then it circles back to detail the background of the perpetrator, his arrogance after the killing, then the victim's situation, and the scene of the crime, and finally returns to the narrative sequence to describe the court trial and verdict. Calling it modern narrative is because it resembles the opening of contemporary movies rather than the approach of traditional storytelling. Dylan used the same technique in the openings of songs like Only a Pawn in Their Game and Hurricane, using shocking scene to grab the listener's attention. Modern narrative structure wasn't Dylan's secret technique, but it remained rare in songwriting. This can be seen as the first technique Dylan used to compete with Richard. Dylan's second technique was applied to the storytelling itself. By storytelling, it emphasizes character, goal, and conflict. The first line of The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll both establishes the characters and implicitly sets a goal. Upon hearing about a murder, people naturally want to know the cause and the outcome. As the story gradually unfolds, the court's verdict becomes the outcome the audience psychologically anticipates. This story goal becomes the overarching suspense of the entire narrative. To intensify this sense of anticipation, Dylan introduced a secondary layer of suspense. In the refrain that follows each verse, he repeatedly emphasizes, "Now ain't the time for your tears. The killer murders and is arrested. That ain't the time for your tears. The killer has strong backing and is overbearing. That still ain't the time for your tears. The victim is pitiful and innocent, yet it's not time for your tears." As you listen, you can't help but wonder, so when exactly is the time for tears? Now reveals the time when you realize that the law protects some killers with a light sentence. That is the moment for your tears. This secondary suspense, reinforcing the story's goal, can be considered Dylan's innovation. The third technique is Dylan's deliberate use of repeatable melody piece, allowing the song's verses to be flexible in length. He had used this technique a year earlier in A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, but never as appropriately and effectively as in this song. Look at the then famous Broadside magazine, which presented The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll on its front page. Let's adjust its presentation.
murder.
We can see that the third melody phrase is a repeatable 4-meter phrase. The first verse, about the murder, repeats it 4 times. The second verse, about the killer's background, repeats it 5 times. The third verse, about the victim, repeats it 9 times. But in the final verse, describing the court scene, it repeats remarkably 11 times. In fact, the extended content isn't all indispensable. It primarily serves to delay the resolution of the suspense, a crucial psychological technique in storytelling. Dylan's ability to apply this to song narrative remains something most songwriters and critics still find puzzling or completely unaware. Regarding the song's melody, some astute peers noticed that the song's tune is adapted from the traditional folk song, Mary Hamilton. Yet few detected the technique Dylan employed here, his skillful appropriation and adaptation of folk material. Some might think borrowing a folk tune is less sophisticated than composing an original melody, but for centuries, people worldwide have adhered to a handful of local tunes. Why is that? Because people adapt to local melodies over time, much like they adapt to local cuisine. It's nourishing and easily digestible. In the most essential sense of song, using local tunes to convey thoughts and feelings is most effective, and innovating upon those local tunes is most worthy. Dylan did not, like most folk singers, directly adopt the melody from the beginning, nor did he, like country musicians, create thematic variations. Instead, he extracted the last 2 phrases from the Mary Hamilton melody, the turn and the conclusion of its 4-phrase structure, as the melodic foundation for his song, interspersed with the aforementioned repetitive phrase. Let's first look at the 4-phrase melody of Mary Hamilton. Dylan borrowed the last 2 phrases. Let's compare the opening and closing phrases of the Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. Don't sound similar, do they? That's because they are sung in different keys. If I transpose the scores to the same key and overlay the music, does the overlap become clear? Dylan chose the turn and conclusion from Mary Hamilton, maybe because he liked these 2 phrases, and maybe to conceal his borrowing tunes. But the most plausible reason is that it perfectly suited the narrative structure of the Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. Whether in prose or music's introduction, development, turn, and conclusion, the turn is often where something startling or sensational emerges. As mentioned, the narrative of Hattie Carroll cuts straight to the point. A murder happened. The abrupt melodic turn provides a perfect accompaniment. This is the 4th technique Dylan layered into this song. And it's not over. Merely from Arcrow's perspective, Dylan used the 5th technique, the extremely long sentence. In this song, he experimented with the unbroken, extended sentences championed by Beat Generation writers. Namely, each of the song's 4 verses is a single sentence. Exceptions might occur in studio or live versions, but it's easy to sense and reconstruct the original composition as one single sentence per verse. Let's look at the longest verse, with the subject in blue and the predicate in red. The effect sought by these long lines is the same as using the repetitive melody piece, leveraging the listener's psychological anticipation of the predicate and the sentence's conclusion, making the narration more urgent and tense, while also whetting the listener's appetite for the awaited trial result. Up to now, we can only say this song layers numerous techniques. Is this unusual for Bob Dylan? But calling this a skill-flaunting output still lacks evidence. We shouldn't focus solely on the song itself, but examine the broader context of its creation. First, the theme this song aims to express is that racial discrimination is tragic because it has institutional protection. This level of insight would be considerable for others, clearly surpassing the theme expressed in Birmingham Sunday, which was a firm belief in racial integration. However, Dylan had already moved beyond this level of understanding. More than 3 months earlier, on June 7, 1963, in his song, Only a Pawn in Their Game, he pointed out that racial discrimination isn't just an individual act, nor even just a manifestation of group or organizational interests, but the result of long-term, systemic, and malicious cultivation. And at this very moment, here in Carroll, his thoughts were on the just-concluded March on Washington gathering, where the organization he identified with, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had been brutally bullied and forced to revise its speech. In an event fighting for equality, oppressed organizations oppressing each other, what equality were they fighting for? After writing The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, he immersed himself in writing numerous so-called prose poems, trying to make sense of these confusions. Parts of this work appeared on the inner sleeve of his subsequent album, The Times They Are A-Changin', under the title 11 Outlined Epitaphs. Much of the content there foreshadows Dylan's subsequent big change and the thematic seeds for many new creations. Compared to these explorations, the insight displayed in The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll appears neither novel nor deep, nor was it his primary concern. To such a casual theme and older perspective, songwriting techniques were so densely layered. What does this indicate? It indicates that this song is Dylan's skill flaunting. From the opposite perspective, a subject matter neither novel nor deep for Dylan himself could still be powerfully eye-opening for most listeners. Coupled with the subtly effective layered techniques, this song is undeniably one of Dylan's greatest works. Content of this video is excerpted from R. Crow's new book, Unveil the Tambourine Man, a critical biography of Bob Dylan.